Hey everybody, I'm Dan McClellan. I'm a scholar of the Bible and religion. My last video, number McClellan 1928, was part one of a two-part response to a creator who was criticizing my video number McClellan 1917 about God's Father. Let's get into part two.
In Exodus 34:6, we also see Adonai declaring the name El once again. But these verses are not alone. As you can see here, Adonai has the same name as El.
So a couple things here. It presupposes univocality to suggest that if you see the equation of Adonai and El anywhere else in the Bible, it means that these other passages must be equating them as well. No, there is a lot of time that is separating these different passages. Two, Genesis 14:20 nowhere mentions Adonai. Genesis 14:22 mentions Adonai. However, we know that's a late addition, because we can look in the Genesis Apocryphon from the Dead Sea Scrolls. We can look in the ancient Greek translation of Genesis 14:22, and Adonai's name does not appear at all, which suggests that the Masoretic version that has the Tetragrammaton in that passage is a late change. Somebody is trying to reinforce the identification of El Elyon as Adonai.
In Genesis 33:20, we could see that Jacob erected a temple to El, but given the context of the story, we know this is for Adonai.
How do we know that, though? Because the name Adonai doesn't occur anywhere at all in Genesis 33, and scholars identify multiple different literary layers to the broader Jacob cycle. And so in order to argue that, you have to reject the scholarly consensus about the different sources that are being brought together for this story. You have to assert univocality. So it's begging the question.
Now about the verses in question, Deuteronomy 32, 8 through 9. It doesn't make sense to me that we see in verses 6 through 7 details of El as a separate God, the actual Most High. But then in verse 39, Adonai has no other gods beside him, and it is he that has the authority over life and death. It seems to me that in Deuteronomy, it's simply Adonai dividing up the nations to the divine council and allotting his portion, Israel, to himself.
So three concerns here. To begin, you do not divide up and then distribute an inheritance to yourself. And verse 8 ends by saying the nations were divided up according to the number of the Bnei Elohim, of the children of God, of the children of Elyon. Whether you identify Elyon with Adonai or not, the number corresponds to the number of their children. And according to the other biblical attestations, as well as broader Northwest Semitic attestations, as at Ugarit and elsewhere, that traditional number of nations is 70. This is what we get in the Table of Nations in Genesis 10. This is the idea we see reflected in Greco-Roman period Jewish literature about the 70 nations of the earth and about having guardian angels over them. This is what we see at Ugarit in the designation of the Bnei Elohim as the 70 sons of Athirat. So 70 is the number, and Israel is one of the 70. So if Elyon is dividing up the nations according to the number of the Bnei Elohim into 70 and then keeping one for themselves, then they're not dividing up the nations according to the number of their children. They're dividing up the nations according to the number of their children plus one. But the text doesn't say that. It is a much simpler conclusion to recognize that this is Elyon dividing up the nations according to the number of their children, among whom is counted Adonai, who receives one of those nations. Problem the second. As I state in my video and as I have argued in print, verses 8 and 9 seem to be quoted speech from an earlier generation. So verse 7 says, "Ask your fathers and they will tell you. Ask your elders and they will say," quote, and then we get verses 8 and 9. So it is being presented as coming down to them from an earlier generation. And the generation that is responsible for the rest of the Song of Moses, I argue, is a post-conflation generation. In other words, they already understand Adonai and El to have been conflated, which is why verse 6 talks about Adonai using imagery based on El's conceptualization as the progenitor of humanity. In the broader Northwest Semitic literature, like that of Ugarit and elsewhere, El is the creator of humanity. El is the father of humanity. El is the progenitor of humanity. And additionally, verse 39 doesn't undermine any of this. This is not a monotheistic statement. This is about the exclusive relationship between Adonai and their people. And so it is not saying there's no other God anywhere. It's just saying, as far as you are concerned, Jacob, my people, there is no other God besides me. And that does not undermine the observation that verses 8 and 9 seem to recognize a distinction between Elyon and Adonai. So nothing in the broader Song of Moses context complicates understanding verses 8 and 9 as preserving an earlier distinction between Elyon and Adonai.
Now, Dan might make the claim that all the texts that associate El to Adonai is just interpolation, and that's a fine hypothesis, but Dan needs to prove his claim and not just assert it.
I don't argue that. I just argue that they are later compositions. Now, Genesis 14:22, the inclusion of the divine name there is a later interpolation, as has been demonstrated already with the Septuagint, with the Genesis Apocryphon from Qumran.
So Dan sees a correlation between the Ugaritic text and Isaiah 27:1 with the twisting serpent and assumes there's a type of appropriation, that they are stealing the story, but once again gives no evidence to this claim.
Well, the evidence is that Isaiah, an 8th century prophet, is quoting a tradition that we already know from a Ugaritic text from 400 to 500 years earlier. And what Isaiah quotes is word for word what we find in that earlier Ugaritic text. We have the chaos monster Leviathan, that's the name in Hebrew. In Ugaritic it's Leton, and both texts refer to Leviathan in parallel as the wriggling serpent, the twisting serpent, and then both refer to Leviathan as the dragon. Isaiah says that lives in the sea. The Ugaritic text says with 7 heads. And so this text already exists in the Ugaritic literature before Hebrew existed, long before Isaiah existed, before any text from the Hebrew Bible existed.
All through scripture and through Near East texts, we see Adonai and other gods battling with the serpent, battling with the sea. So why is it that Dan concludes that these texts have been appropriated, but he doesn't conclude that they may be declaration? As in, the Israelites are saying that no, it's not Baal that defeats the serpent, but instead it's Adonai.
That is what I'm saying. But they have to appropriate it first. They are telling the same story using the exact same words, but they're taking Baal out and putting Adonai in. That's precisely what I'm claiming.
But when we look at all the texts of Israel using the name El in place of Adonai, and the fact that the chaos motif is widely used in the Near East, it seems to me it's most likely that El is Adonai, unless Dan can show us some conclusive evidence that proves otherwise.
So there's an apologetic sleight of hand going on here, because this creator is setting up their particular interpretation, which derives from their religious dogmas, as the default, saying if you don't have conclusive evidence for your claim, well, we have to default to mine. The evidence is far weaker for this creator's claim, however. Additionally, we pretty much never have the luxury of conclusive evidence when it comes to reconstructing the development and the interpretation of traditions as ancient as these. And so we have to weigh probabilities and figure out which is more probable. And as I have already pointed out, the majority of scholars agree with my reconstruction of this. This is the consensus view. This creator is arguing against the consensus view, and they lack the evidence that they need to make that argument, because they can only presuppose that Adonai existed all the way back to the 13th century BCE and was already identified as the Northwest Semitic high deity El, even though we have no evidence whatsoever for the existence of any such deity until we get to the 9th century BCE. Now, this comes down to predispositions. People who are not open to my conclusion are obviously not going to find my conclusion more likely. They are going to be intuitively drawn to the conclusion that agrees with the dogmas they're bringing to this argument. And this is why it's so important to note that this is the consensus view of scholars. People who are open to this conclusion, not necessarily that presuppose it or that need it or that want it or are dogmatically committed to it. Scholars that are just open to this conclusion overwhelmingly agree that this is the most likely conclusion. So opposition to this conclusion is not based on a look at the evidence that is attempting to achieve objectivity. Opposition to this conclusion is based on dogmatism.